So to start off, I wanted to kind of talk about your past work and your process and how you got to the current techniques you employ in your paintings. Some of the words that we tend to use when talking about this is like vernacular locations, gardens, skate parks, things like that. So I'm just wondering where those interests came from and how your techniques in painting and making the image comes from to like kind of play with that.
Sure. I think there's a lot of answers to that, and I think one of the things that is important to me is I'm always noticing things around me for inspiration in my work. So, sorry. So I think I'm mostly drawn to things that are not like these grand heroic scenes, but more like the sidewalk that I'm walking down, or a pile of garbage on the street or something like that. And so I'm sort of drawn to these moments that are more human or vulnerable, and I feel like those are sort of the things that speak to our everyday experience and all those things that are kind of coming together to make our real lives and not like this sublime thing that we don't really experience. And so I think, when I was doing most of these works that are based on gardens and things like that, it sort of, for me, became a parallel process-wise to, a garden. Sort of putting together a garden was analogous to the process of me making my paintings, because while I did go to art school and everything, I sort of makeshift my way around the canvas, and I just put things together and kind of hope it works. And I think that's where some of these, what you call techniques, come from, which is more just like an experimental thing of like, oh, I wonder what will happen if I do this, and I wonder how these colors will work together. I wonder what happens if I put the paint on the floor and put the painting on top of it, or that kind of thing, So it's just sort of like a trying things out kind of
what
thing.
I call techniques. Thanks. So it sounds like you're plotting essentially, and so that process of like plotting a garden, saying carrots here, beans here, and maybe that'll work. I don't know about soil. That kind of plays into this notion.
Yeah, and I think when if we want to go down the garden trajectory, I think
the garden
path, you might say. I started actually gardening about 4 years ago, and it was really kind of one of those things that's like, I don't know anything about it. I'm gonna see what happens, and if it doesn't work this time, I'll try something different the next time, So it's sort of a thing that, like, yes, nature takes over and there's a real process involved, but from my point of view, it's like, that is magic. I can't believe it happened, so. Yeah.
How does science or art even work? And that actually brings me to a question further down on my list that I'd like to talk about. So Niki's studio is located in her home, and there's something really interesting about the connection between your studio being in your home and also the locations that you're depicting are very domestic. They're very homely. They're hallways, staircases, gardens, of course, and other moments that feel more domestic. They feel more intimate. So I'm just wondering how working at home impacts your depictions of the, quote, home, and how that kind of affects your painting, or if it's even relevant at all in the first place.
Yeah, I don't know if it would be different if my studio is outside my home, but I do think that I sort of, in my everyday life, I inhabit many different places. So I work in Manhattan, but my house is about an hour outside of the city in like a suburban area, and then which is very adjacent to the Hudson River and the forest. So I feel like within one day I could easily experience all those different things. And like I was saying, like all of those visual elements that I see, like I can't stop noticing things around me, and I sort of put them all in my brain, and then I get back to my studio, and then these things come out onto the canvas, juxtapositions and interesting things like that. So I feel like I'm grateful that because when I did live in the city, I was still noticing things, but my paintings tended to be sort of one thing. And so now, just looking around the room at the paintings, I don't necessarily believe that everyone would recognize what they're looking at, but I can see the references. Like in the back, there's like a you don't have to look, but it's just a suburban wall that was next to a driveway in my neighborhood, and then a tree that was planted in a park, and then there was some like in the back that was just something I remembered from walking to someone's house in Brooklyn, and someone had like little garden set up on their stoop that was like this big. And so I think like being able to bring all of those things in as I kind of consider going on walks to be part of my process too. Just it's like research and yeah.
That actually, I'm about to feel super scholarly right now. That reminds me of a Virginia Woolf quote. She said something to the effect of, I don't remember it verbatim, I'm not that good, but she said something to the effect that we, when looking at books, we tend to think of them existing separately from each other, when in reality books continue each other, and that it's really this notion that art itself doesn't exist in a vacuum. So there's something interesting about the way that your paintings function together. It feels like we're on a walk. It feels like we're on a walk through the neighborhood or through whatever, and they're all continuing each other. And like I say that specifically, now I'm looking at this gallery for the first time in this specific context, and I'm seeing these two paintings in the back, and I'm seeing that yellow kind of fade into the other yellow and green. I'm like, oh, I laid that out really smart, didn't I?
You had no idea.
I had no idea. I was so smart. But like there is something really interesting about how there are moments in these paintings that relate to each other, and thus like they do kind of continue a conversation. They feel like they continue this conversation. Thoughts on that? That's a kind of question on the fly.
Yeah.
But.
No, I think I've always been a person who I tend not to repeat the same painting over again. It's really, I mean, that's sort of like a intention in my head to not do that, but also I am incapable of doing it. Like I just certain motifs just just don't come up again, and I want to always be surprised by something, and sort of so that kind of every time I start a painting, that sort of ends, takes me back to square one in a way. But it's also, I think what I'm realizing the older I get and the more I work is that you can't be a new artist. Well, no, you are a new artist every time, but there's always a thread that continues from one to the next, and you can't really remove your hand, really. You can't remove certain traits that, come up in everything. Even, I think, like, because there was a 10-year period where I did not make any paintings, and I was doing video and sculpture and performance and installation and basically anything but painting. And I, looking back on that, I'm like, oh, they were still paintings. They were still this painterly sensibility, I think, still about experimental process, still about surfaces and marks, and so I think it's interesting. You can't really, I don't know what else I would be. I was going to say, if I was a doctor, that's probably not an apt relationship, but I kind of feel like anything that I do, I sort of bring the same focus to it, the same vision to it.
If you were a doctor, your sutures would just be so perfectly embroidered into the flesh.
They would be experimental.
Embroidered into flesh is a great show title.
Okay.
So remember that, or I should remember that. That actually, it's funny that you mentioned your videos too, because Savannah Hampton, in her essay that we commissioned for this show, which is in the binder in the back, she actually references your video work. And it's so interesting how these are paintings. These are capital P, paint. Mm-hmm. And it's so interesting to think about how you did spend that 10-year moment in your life not painting, or not capital P painting at least. So I was wondering, like, could you break that down a little bit more? Like, you kind of already did it a little bit, but could you break it down a little bit more about what led you to that and how you eventually returned back to this more painterly process?
Yeah, so I have always been a painter from like high school, and about 2003 or 2002, I sort of started feeling like everything, it sort of felt like a default to me, like painting on rectangular canvas with paint was something that I had never questioned before, and then I started thinking like, oh, maybe I should question why those things are happening. So it wasn't really a turning away from painting as much as it was like, let me just see what I can expand. And it actually, now that I'm really thinking about it, it just was like, oh, maybe I'll paint on canvas that's not stretched and it's hanging down to the floor, or maybe then that'll become a sculptural element. And then sort of without realizing it, I wasn't making paintings anymore. I was making sculpture, and then they were installations, and then I was in grad school, so they were videos, and and so it was sort of like I was sort of flying without a net in a way, because I had no idea what I was doing. I hadn't been trained in any of that kind of thing, and it was sort of like, I'm going to see if this garbage can be something. And so I did that for about 10 years, and it was, a lot of the work, actually, the videos, for example, they literally used paint in the videos. So I have a video that Savannah mentioned where I used paint and I wrapped my husband's and my arm together as if sort of like the idea that marriage is a thing that you both have to believe in. It's basically meaningless except for what you kind of put into it. It's not like we're actually roped together. So I was continually still using these art-making processes and trying to find the symbology in them, even though it wasn't like it ended with a art object. And a lot of my work was, tasks, maybe making something or destroying something, and sort of felt like I was still making work, but it was just the end product was a video instead of an object. Coming back to painting, it's not as nice or clean of a story, I guess. It was just sort of like wow, none of the work I'm doing makes any sense. And you know what used to make sense was painting. And it sort of was like the sculpture and video I guess I wasn't doing video at that point, but I had also just had a child, and nothing was making sense for me. And
as children are wont to do.
And I'm not sleeping, and I don't know what I'm doing. And I had this visual in my head that it's not real, I made it up, but like working with the sculptural materials I had felt to me like I was working with wet cotton candy, where it was like it's disappearing before my eyes. I don't know what I'm doing, and it just felt so, impossible. And I was like, well, I think I still have some paint. I think I still have some canvas. Let me just try, because I need to do something that feels good. And, it's interesting. I feel like now, so this was probably 5 years ago that I returned to painting. And I'm so glad that I did all the work in between, because I feel like it feeds the work I do now still. And I think I just wasn't a good enough painter before to do the things I'm trying to do now. And it was sort of like, I need, all these different things, sculpture and whatever, to try to do, because painting won't do it. But it was like, no, you're just not good enough of a painter to do that. And now I sort of feel like, who says painting can't, capture time? Who says painting can't actually be an object or have depth or have something that you could walk around or step into, even if it is a two-dimensional surface?
Clement Greenberg, probably. That's a modernism joke.
Yeah. He would say that, wouldn't he?
He would say that.
Where is that guy? Just kidding.
Dead. But that also reminds me, speaking of scholarly things, it reminds me of a John Waters quote, where he says so many creatives quit early in their career because their taste level is higher than their technique level. And so there's something really interesting how you physically kind of felt that returning and painting, oh, I'm suddenly good at this. What do you know? Grad school was maybe worth it. It never is. I'm kidding. I loved grad school. Kind of shifting gears, something that we've talked about a little bit in the past, we talked about this notion of place versus scene. And the title of your show, Chewing the Scenery, I kind of wanted to talk to you about where you came to choosing and thinking about that as your title. Because I know I have my feelings, but I want to hear your feelings.
Yeah, I feel like it's a lot of different things. It did come to me as I was walking around my neighborhood, just sort of out of the blue. But I feel like it's a lot of different things. It's sort of about, because these are all kind of about location that feels real, but you sort of question if it is real. So imagining scenery around you, and imagining over theatrics, overacting, that kind of thing. And I think I said to you also the idea of chewing the scenery as a verb is over the top crazy thing, but chewing is something that's you do every day, you don't think about it, and it's really mundane. So kind of bringing all those things together. And interestingly, after I had thought of that as the title is when sort of theater came into my work. While I was at a residency in November, I started thinking a lot about and this relates to the scene and place thing also, I think. I started thinking about, expanding from the idea of locations and sort of thinking about figure and ground relationships, and just how it's such an extremely simple two-dimensional art concept, but it really, I sat and made a list of all of the iterations of it, and it was like pages and pages. And one of the things that came up was a theater, and like actor and stage, or protagonist, antagonist, or audience and actor, all those different kinds of things where things are in front of each other or opposing each other. And so that was sort of something really interesting to me, and I feel like I've barely scratched the surface of that. But I think, back to your question about scene versus place, because I really like what you've said about that in the past, I sort of feel like these are, like when I think of those two concepts as you explain them, a place is... Wait, could you say your definitions?
I can totally go into that. So I have this theory. I have these ideas about the word scene versus place and how it's used in art and what it means to me at the very least, where scene is something that we can project something onto. And I think about that in a theatrical sense. I think specifically in what I wrote about it, I referenced Tennessee Williams. Wow, there goes my scholarly mind. Streetcar. I mentioned Streetcar, and how when we go to see a production of Streetcar Named Desire, we see the set, and we know it's Louisiana because of different things that we understand are Louisiana, but otherwise we're projecting that onto that because we're told. Whereas place feels more intimate. A place is something where it's like, no, this is my place. This is something that is lived in. It is something that is specific, yet is still relatable. So ultimately, I was saying that these were not scenes, that you were not chewing the scenery, you were chewing the placery. But I didn't want to take away from the theatrical notion of that term. So those were that's contextualizing my feelings on place versus scene.
Yeah, I think I agree, and I think like the idea of place, as you describe it, like, does relate to these pieces, because I feel like I want to create a place or a space that the viewer could see themselves in, or that they could imagine occupying, even though it's not so black and white, because at the same time I sort of always want to undercut that and make it feel like the ground is shifting under your feet, but still that there is at least some part of each of them that is sort of nailed in place. And I think a scene makes me, and maybe this is part of why painting to me before was unsatisfying, because if you think of it as a scene, it's just something that you are looking at, facing, and it's looking back at you, not that it's something that you could join.
Yeah. A place is definitely something that you can be invited into, whereas a scene is something that you just kind of observe. For sure. But there's something also about chewing the scenery as a title that still fits into this work because of your palette. Your color palette is so dramatic. It's so out there in all the right ways, and something that I tend to see them as being very saturated without becoming overbearing. So I want to kind of talk to you about, like, where do you get your palette? You talk about walking a lot and kind of getting a lot of these this imagery from walks, but these colors don't necessarily exist. At least I've been to your house. These colors don't exist in your neighborhood. So like, where do these colors come from then?
Yeah, I think I treat color very intuitively, and I really am looking at what each painting needs. And so some of them parts of them may start out with, oh, this is what I observed, but then the rest of what happens around it is like to balance that out, or to wrap it in a blanket, or to whatever the painting needs. But it's also a way of guiding your eye through things, or creating depth in things. If it's like a shadow or something that's or a gradient that is sort of like sweeping you one way or another. But also I have so even as I'm approaching all of this, you could say emotionally, I always try to kind of trip myself up a little bit, like maybe you know, for example, this yellow and purple one in the middle, like, that yellow is like, what? You know, or the yellows, I suppose, like, because I think I was trying to, like, challenge myself to be able to do something with that yellow, to try to, like, balance it out. And then yellow just never went away. It was just like it kept
yeah, yellow's coming. Everywhere in this gallery,
yeah.
for sure.
And I also, you know, I kind of set up not set up rules for myself, but last year I started feeling a little complacent with my colors, and so I specifically went out and bought like 5 or 6 tubes of color that I hate, that I have never, you know, phthalo green and viridian and like all of these things that I've always been, and I bought some gold, you know, things that I've never been able to find a place for or use for, and I just made myself use them, and it was actually great. It was actually a really interesting lesson, and like you can make anything work if you want to, you know.
Yeah.
But I've heard more than one person say to me, like, boy, you're not afraid of color, are you? And I don't think it was a compliment. So I don't know. It's not for everybody, I guess. Yeah.
That's really funny. Nobody should be afraid of color.
No, that's true.
And you know, speaking of your process too, and I think it's great and hilarious too that you challenge yourself. I tried doing that using only black and white. It lasted a week. But you know, we've been working on this show for a while now. You were chosen last year, and then we eventually were able to meet and all that stuff. And in our first studio visit, you showed me these collages that you had made out of different magazine clippings and things like that. And recently, during our last studio visit, you actually showed me, hey, I'm doing more with these, and I bought a big fancy printer and all that fun stuff. And you're using your imagery, your own imagery now, to make more collages and also incorporate the collage into the painting. I'm just kind of wondering, like, how's that going?
Yeah, really good. So there's a kind of 2 different things, and the preparatory collages that you were talking about is a new process for me that I started last year. Just making preparatory studies is like whoa! I never had done that before. And
artists have been doing that for centuries, and yet here's Niki going
and
like, I have an idea.
Yeah, it's a great idea. Look what I invented. And it was a way of playing with different iterations of the same kind of thing, but it's sort of like, I sort of felt like by the time I then brought it to the canvas, I had already sweat out the imagery, like I had already earned it before I got to the canvas, and then I could just, I mean, there was still plenty to do at that point, like there was still, you know, lots of, I mean, just even making something small into something big there's so much that can go wrong there. So figuring those things out, and the color usually changed. I mean, everything changed in that transposition, but that then left me room for all the experimentation I wanted to do that wasn't like, you know, because sometimes before I was very inefficient, and I would start a painting and then like a month in I would be like, oh, this should have been vertical, something like that, you know. And so this sort of like solved those steps in a way that was fun too, and like I could quickly experiment like 10 different ways in an afternoon. And I think talking about the collage in the actual work, I've always been sort of an alchemist in my studio, and I mean, even actually from when I was a kid, I would like mix things together that I wasn't supposed to and like play with different stuff, and so even when I was just making, like, the product coming out of my studio was just paintings, like I would have a bunch of like mad scientist stuff going on the side, you know, and I feel like that kind of thing is, like, I don't think of my work as like a timeline. It's sort of like a spiral, and things are always, collage is always there, sculpture's always kind of there, like all different things, drawing, all that kind of stuff is all sort of there, and I just keep encountering them again and again. But it's been interesting to, and I also like that, like, I can use collage and I don't have to use collage if I don't want to, you know, different things like that. The printer you mentioned has been really exciting because, you know, I've also on these walks been taking photos, and so now I'm actually printing them out as larger things that could be the beginning of a painting instead of just like a reference or, and I even just recently printed out several things, actually maybe some of the things you saw in my studio that were just hanging there for months, and I was like, what should I do with them? And then I was like, I don't have to do anything. Maybe they're just, that's it.
Yeah,
maybe I hang this photo next to this painting, and that's what my work is now, So it's been really exciting to, be able to have all of these different things going on at the same time.
I remember there was this really funny moment, too, when you were showing me the printer and the new prints and things like that, where we were picking up the paintings, me and my friend Alexis, who's also trained as a printmaker, and you were like, they're so nice, I don't want to do anything to them. And we look at you, we're just like, print another one then. Like apple pea, and you've got two, and then you can paint
different.
them. Like,
it's different for me.
Why are you being so precious, girl?
Yeah.
And that leads me on to my last question for Niki, which is, what's next for Niki Kriese?
Oh, goodness. Maybe get some dinner? I don't know. No.
We are getting dinner. Don't worry.
Good question. I mean, I think I mentioned the prints, which is a very exciting new thing for me. It's sort of like maybe I could do this. Like, it just was something that never felt like it was allowed before. So I think just allowing myself to be able to do things is always an exciting new development. And another thing that I started in the last few months, but has been sort of not a secret, but I just haven't, I just didn't want to tell anyone. But as I'm working in this like landscape realm sort of, I've really been making bodies. Like I've been using figures, but they're abstracted to a degree that you would not see them, and it's just my way of grounding something in gravity and weight and gesture, and using a thing that's recognizable to me as movement and activity in a place, and so I'm pushing that a lot more, and so that's a very exciting thing, and I might actually make it like known more than this room, but
well, the video will be on YouTube,
exactly.
So it's going to be in the public realm. No, but you shared that painting of you like taking a tick off of your leg from that residency. That was so gruesome, but like in such a good way.
Yeah.
And like you even pointed out some in here, like, oh yeah, that's an arm right there. And I was just like, I'm sorry, what? Like you're hiding it, but now you're talking about going more explicit in terms of like opaqueness. That's definitely a figure.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Because I do want that questioning. I don't want someone to be like, oh yeah, I see it, but it is like I'm really bad at keeping secrets, and I'm really bad at like pretending that it's something else, so I'm like, this is a painting of a person going in for a hug and the other person's giving them a high five, and like the awkward moment. But
that's a really funny painting. That's a real painting she's referring to. It's really funny.
But and I'm also, what's next in life? I'm going to another residency in August. I'm going to be at the Vermont Studio Center.
Very cool. Congratulations. That's a big deal one.
Thank you. I'm excited. And then I have a show in Chicago in October.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's my year at this point.
That's a good year. Like, we're only in March. Yeah. That's a good year.
Yeah. So I feel like, I just want to get stuff out there and, have more meeting events like this where we can meet people. Yeah.
Yay.
Awesome.
At this point, I believe we can open it up to questions. If anybody has questions.
Yeah,
Really quick, I'm just going to repeat it into the microphone.
Oh, sure, of course.
For those of you who didn't hear, the question is about opacity versus washiness, and how conscious that is, and how that comes apart in the process. So go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to turn. I think it's sort of not conscious as like, here's what I'm going to do right now. I think of those as just different tools in a way, like different ways of working, and maybe I squeegee something on or something like that. All of these things are just like, another step. But I do really like, I like the contrast in those two ways of working, and I really like paintings that show you their history, and so that's always something that I want to show. And then other times, like in this piece, I really want to like block that history out in certain parts, and so I think, it's really just about different viscosities of the paint and different ways of what different things my hands want to do, Yeah.
that piece right above you, such a perspective sitting here, like you describe your walks. I walk a lot too, I'm a photographer, and I go a lot without my camera. That's so beautifully depth and perspective. Like I am walking through corridors, it's one above, so different from the steps to the right. Is there a tell us a particular story on that?
Sure. This was, to keep looking at it, this was actually very, very straight from collage that I had made, and it was different interiors from magazines, and that's actually like a model walking down across the page. But at the same time, this was when I was on residency. I was at the Malay colony in Austerlitz, New York, which is in the middle of nowhere. And so I would go for daily walks in the woods. And so I think there was, in some way, I was trying to bridge both of those experiences of like, my regular everyday experience, like walking through Manhattan is different from walking through these mountains, but also taking something that's from like this very fancy magazine that was not my everyday experience, and then very different from the rustic setting that I was in, just sort of trying to merge those different experiences. Yeah.
Well, that's moving.
Oh, thank you.
Sitting in the right place.
Thank you so much.
Everybody, go ahead and sit in that seat after the talk. You had your hand up?
Yes, I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about your materials and your techniques, just kind of in general, what you use, and the one part of the painting, the very last one on the top, that row, that smoky.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how you got that, and in general, your materials that you use.
So in the microphone, the question is about materials, how she goes about choosing them, a kind of specific question about some certain moments. So take it away, Niki.
Oh, thank you so much. I mainly use acrylic paint, and I have, in the last few years, just been collecting random things like tools to use on, if it's different, like pieces of plastic to make scrapes or rollers to make different surfaces. And that particular piece was the first bit of spray paint that I used on my canvas. So, and I was trying, and I actually, first I splashed out some water, and then I sprayed it to see what would happen, and just, where the water was, it didn't stick the right way, that kind of thing. So that's why it has sort of like a airbrush quality, but then like a ragged quality in different parts. And it's, back to the collage question, and my desire to return to painting after doing all different other things. And it's sort of a struggle to, when I say like, I'm a painter, I'm making paintings. All the things that I could do before, I can do in painting now. So I feel like I'm being a little conservative with my materials because I still want them to be paint. And like what is, I don't want to say cheating, because nothing's cheating, but like what is too far off track that it's going to be not painting, or, so it's always a question in my head. Yeah. So
It sounds like something similar you said earlier about like you make guidelines for your practice. That sounds like just like another form of that, another form of guideline where it's like, no, it has to be liquid.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be something liquid.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Yeah, Rebecca.
I was wondering about when you said you started painting again about 5 years ago after having done sculpture and video and kind of everything but painting. I guess it's a personal question, but did you feel like you came home?
Aww.
Are you going to repeat that, or can
yeah,
I just...
the question is, when you came back to painting, did you feel like you came home?
The answer is yes. The answer is yes, but I felt like I had to teach myself how to paint again at the same, it was sort of like riding a bike, but I fell a lot. And that, it was like comfortable, but they were so bad at first, and I didn't know what direction to go in. I didn't know like what, and it, it's probably 2 years before I felt like what I was making was even up to whatever standards I had, but it was a relief because I felt like, when I started working in non-painting, I'll say, it was exciting and it was new and like, look at all the things I can do, and like, I can make these sentences that equal something and that, they're meaningful to me. And then all of a sudden it gradually felt like the meaning had emptied from what I was doing, and that it wasn't what my body was supposed to be doing. And then painting is what my body is supposed to be doing,
That's a really fascinating way to think about art making too. This notion that like we forget that our bodies have to do something to make art, and this idea like your body felt. That's so fascinating, and that makes so much sense when you're talking about like putting the figure into the painting too. It's like everything's cyclical with you, girl. Everything's a spiral.
It all checks out. Yeah.
Any other questions? Will.
Yeah, I'm wondering. I work here, so I get to see paintings pretty much every day.
I'm sorry, sir. Who are you?
And I find that I'm surprised by them very often, and that there's something new that I encounter. And I'm wondering, does that happen to you too? When you look at a painting that you've made, you find new things in it?
I do, yeah. Even paintings so I have paintings hanging in my living room that are 4 years old, maybe 5 years old, and I still catch myself, like I stop myself when I'm walking past, like, oh, wait a second, I don't know that it's seeing something new, but it's just seeing it in a different perspective or different, like, whereas something before was in front of the other, now it's shifted, and now I'm looking at it in a different way, and it does look like a new painting in that way, which is exciting. So, yeah, thank you. I crammed so much in there that, of course, it's going to take a while to unpack it, so, yeah.
That's a wonderful place to end it.
Yeah.
Again, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Niki, for being amazing.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Neil and Real Artways, so much.
Absolutely. Literally anytime. Well, not anytime. And please, eat the snacks.